So in this lesson, we're going to be doing the operations with complex numbers. Operations would be like adding, subtracting, multiplying, dividing, those type of things with complex numbers. And so let's go ahead and get started with this. First thing we're going to be doing is just taking a complex number here. We have 8 plus 3i and subtracting 2 minus 4i. So if we were to adding them, it's just kind of like terms. If I had 8 plus 3x minus 2 plus 4x, it would be the same thing that I'm doing here. I have a real part that I can add to a real part, and I have an imaginary part that I can add to an imaginary part. And so, however, what makes it a little bit difficult is I would have to insert like a -1 here, and I think sometimes it makes it easier to distribute that -1. So it would actually look something like this. We would have 8 plus 3i, and then minus 2 minus 4i. And so if I combine my real parts together, 8 minus 2 is 6. And then if I combine my imaginary parts together, 3i minus 4i is minus I. So the difference between the two complex numbers that we have in number 1 is 6 minus I, or 6 minus 1i. So in number 2, the same kind of thing here. I'm going to distribute my -1, and I'm going to have 7 minus 3. And then -1 times 2i is -2i. And so I'll just combine my like terms. 7 minus 3 is 4. And then I have the -2i. And so that's really adding. I didn't go over an example where you're adding them. You just add like terms. So let's move on to multiplying imaginary numbers together. So these do not have the real components to the complex numbers. They just have the imaginary components here. And I'm going to multiply these together just like I would multiply 5x times 4x. 5i times 4i is 20i squared. But now one thing we're going to have to realize is this. We know that if I take the square root of -1, that's equal to I. And so what does I squared equal? Well, if I square both sides here, then over here on this side I'll have I squared, and that equals the square root of -1 squared. With the squared and the square root part cancel each other out, which means I squared is -1. So if we go back to problem number 3, we have 20 times I squared, but I squared is -1. So this is 20 times -1, which is -20. So here we have an example of two imaginary numbers that when we multiply them together, we get a real number. 5i times 4i is -20. Same thing here with number 4. You might want to pause the video, make sure that you try it on your own first, and then start the video to make sure that you got it right. But if I want to multiply these together, I'm going to have -6 times 2 is -12, but I times I is I squared. But since I squared is -1, this is -12 times -1, which is +12. And so -6i times 2i is +12. So that's multiplying the imaginary parts together. Now let's multiply the entire complex number part together. So here we have 6 minus 5i times 4 minus 3i. And yes, we are going to have to FOIL here. I'm going to start by taking 6 times 4 is 24. And then 6 times -3i is -18, -18i. Then if I distribute my -5i, -5i times 4 is -20i. And -5i times -3i is +15i squared. But I want to combine like terms. And so this term here is -15i squared. Well, that's going to be 15 times -1, which is -15. And if I take my 24 and my -15, that is 9. So I have for my real component 9, and then my imaginary component, if I combine those like terms, -18i and a -20i is -38i. And so that is going to give me a complex number of 9 minus 38i. If I do the same thing over here, you might want to pause your video, try it on your own first, and then start the video and make sure that you got it right. So hopefully you've done that. 4 times 4 would be 16. 4 times 3i is 12i. And then negative 9i times 4 is negative 36i. And then negative 9i times positive 3i is negative 27i squared. So I'm going to take my negative 27i squared. The I squared is negative 1. So negative 27 times negative 1 is positive 27. And 16 plus 27, let's see, that would be 36, 43. And if I combine my imaginary parts, 12i minus 36i is minus 24i. And so that gives me a complex number of 43 minus 24i. That's what we're working on for our homework assignment for today. We will see you tomorrow in class.